Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. It is our inaugural webinar in a series that we intend will be convening around social policy and social protection in relation to employment creation. So thanks everyone, to the organizers, our colleagues that have ensured that we're able to convene this webinar, and on behalf of our standing committee, ASSAf standing committee on the science of the reduction of poverty and inequality. We thank all the colleagues and the committee members and the two today our fellow members that are going to be presenting in today's the first in the series of the webinars that we convening. I'm Vusikumede, currently with the University of Mpumalanga. And I think maybe just to acknowledge everyone who's joining and hope I'm audible. I should have asked that at the beginning. I hope you can hear me. To acknowledge everyone who's been part of this, who's attending today, being part of this important webinar. We do know that we have a challenge in many of our countries in the continent with regards to social and economic development, and often a debate about what is that we need to ensure that there's improvements, there are improvements in well-being. And there are those of us over the years now, following Professor Jima Desina, who's going to present here, the late Professor Thandika Mkandawiri, and many others who've, sort of put it into the agenda that actually largely the answer or part of the answer policy. And here in South Africa, we've had this debate over many years, and some of us arguing that part of the reason we're not able to advance well-being is largely because we've not really had a comprehensive social policy. Indeed, we've got aspects of social protection, and I think there'll be discussions about that. So let me not perhaps steal the thunder from our presenters and also webinars. So in the interest of time, I won't go into a lot of detail. I do want to welcome Professor Jima Desina, who was known to, if I were to go through his bio, we'll be spending a lot of time. He's going to kick us off, and Prof. Jima Desina is currently the research chair on social policy at the University of South Africa. He's a mentor to many of us. He was the president of the South African Sociological Association. He's been for many years involved with Codestria, where some of us were groomed, and he's played many roles, and of course, really around social policy, significant research that he has done, supervised many students that are dealing with social policy publications, numerous that he has presented, and of course, influence that is had in shaping the discourse around social policy in the continent, and especially here at home in South Africa. So with those few words, I'm going to allow us that we kick off and allow Prof. Jima Desina to present. We'll be taking questions, and please do write in the chat, and you'll be given an opportunity as well to make a comment or input or question during the presentation. And Prof. Desina is going to kick us off with an overview of social policy in South Africa. Over to you, Prof. You might be muted, Prof.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
There we are.
I'm trying to get the... Thank you, Professor Gumede. The remit that I have is to provide an overview of social policy in South Africa. And I start off by electing to choose the conception of social policy that Thandika Mkandawili provided. Social policy, for instance, is understood as a collective intervention to affect welfare, social institutions, and social relations directly. And social policy, by its nature, is framed by a set of issues. There's the normative and what I may call the ideational underpinning, the philosophical undercurrent that holds the social policy framework together, the rules in terms of eligibility criteria of inclusion and exclusion, who may benefit, who may not benefit, especially in the area of public welfare, and the institutional design of the social policy architecture itself, including delivery mechanisms. And social policy is concerned with 5 main issues. It's concerned with the redistributive effect of economic policy, the protection of people from the vagaries of market and the changing circumstances of life, the enhancement of the productive potential of members of society, and the reconciliation of the burden of reproduction with that of other social tasks, which brings in the social reproduction and the gender dimension of social policy. And then there's the enhancement of social cohesion and nation building projects. And from this we arrive at what we call the 5 tasks of social policy: the production task, the protection task, redistribution, reproduction, and nation building task of social policy. And it draws on a variety of a diversity of policy domains and instruments, from education to health, to housing, to agrarian reform, to labor market, affirmative action, family care, family and child care, child support, old age, social insurance, and fiscal policy. To provide, and I'll now get into the overview of social policy in South Africa. First is to sketch out the normative, or what we call the additional framing of social policy in the South African context. And here we go to the constitutionally guaranteed rights that are afforded to people in the South African context within the 1996 Constitution. First is Section 26 talks about housing, for instance, the right of access to adequate housing, and enjoins, the state to take responsible, reasonable legislative and other means within its available resources to achieve progressive realization of this right. This will come across repeatedly in the Bill of Rights, the progressive realization, of these rights, rather than something that is assumed to be available immediately. Then there's this Section 27 talks about healthcare, food, water, and social security. And with healthcare, for instance, it guarantees the right to healthcare, including reproductive healthcare. It guarantees the right to sufficient food and water, and social security. And this qualifier to have access to social assistance becomes important if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents. is the right available. So this introduces the principle of public welfare eligibility based on selection. Section 27, subsection 2 calls for the state to ensure the progressive realization of the rights within its available resources. The right to emergency medical treatment is unabridged. Now, when we look at the right to social policy component in terms of housing and education, we come to a context of what we call stratified, segmented, and segregated social policy. Segregated not on the basis of race, but on the basis of mean tests, that limits that selects those who may be eligible for access to the provision of public welfare. For instance, in the housing sector, for instance, housing availability in the South African context is predominantly market-based and private, market-based private access to housing. Public housing, what is called the breaking new ground, or not to use the pejorative of RDP houses, but beyond RDP houses, for instance, is targeted at the poor. And between 1994 and 2000, for instance, 3.4 million houses units were built, and almost 1.3 million, service sites, completed. Still, 2.5 million households were on the National Housing Needs Register as of February 2023. And according to the 2022 census, 1.4 million households were in informal dwelling. When it comes to education, access to education, again, remains highly stratified and segmented with various grades of schools, ranging from private, fee-paying schools to no-fee schools. In 1996, the exemption of parents from payment of school fees, for instance, regulation was released and introduced the mean test for exemption from fees based on parents' combined annual gross income. In 2007, the government introduced the no-fee schools program, which was to further address financial barriers to education, which initially targeted the poorest 40% of schools. In 2019, for instance, about 9.6 million learners studied at no-fee schools, which accounted for 49% of learners. Combined with this is the provision of meals, at schools, in which in 2022-2023, the government spent 8.4 million on its, national school nutrition program, feeding 9.7 million learners in 21,000 schools, which is 3 in 4 learners attending public schools. Higher education, for instance, we have the case of NSFAS, which was established in 1999 to provide financial assistance to deserving beneficiaries who qualify for, post-school education and training. This access to the financial assistance is based on mean testing, and the most recent mean test, for instance, requires that combined gross income of the households should not exceed 350,000 per year. Although in the case of the students with disability, this threshold was raised to 600,000. That's for those who want to apply for bursary. However, students from households of income between 350,000 and 600,000 qualify for NSFAS loan. The budget in 2024 was 50 billion over, initial preliminary clearance of 1.1 million students who were funded, in 2024. Funding covers fees books, accommodation, and stipend for upkeeps. In the case of healthcare, which is an important component of social policy in any particular context, access remains highly stratified and segmented mainly between the private sector healthcare sector and the public sector in provision of healthcare. And within the private sector itself, access through medical insurance remains highly stratified with different options available for various enrollees, or members of medical aid. In 2024, and on the face of it, this is not particularly bad performance of combined health spending of 8.81% of GDP. But we know that about 16% of the population dependent on private health insurance, with about 84.58 of the population depending on public health systems. The private health insurance, private health system, for instance, accounted for 50% of total spending, usually through private healthcare providers. And one government-employed doctor, for instance, is available for 2,457 people, whereas in the private, the medical aid registered doctors, for instance, they will see between 439 and 571 people. It's been argued that about 80% of the specialists are in the private health sector. And an average spending, for instance, it's been argued, was a quarter, in the public healthcare sector is a quarter of the average spending in the private sector. The healthcare reform, healthcare funding reform, which is the National Health Insurance Policy, for instance, which argues for a universal access at no cost at the point of use, faces considerable headwind and challenges in courts by various role players, stakeholders in the sector. Social assistance, for instance, which is the more widely studied part of public welfare provision in the South African context, is highly mean-tested, which goes back to the provision of the Constitution in terms of access and eligibility to social assistance, only in the demonstrable case where people are not able to provide for themselves, So it remains means-tested, and this is made up of several social grants. In 2022, for instance, 37% of the population received social grants, and for almost 50% of the households receive at least one social grant. After salaries, social grants, for instance, are the second most important source of household income. Child support grants is arguably the one that with the largest number of beneficiaries, beneficiaries, growing from 8.1 million, 8.2 million in 2007, 2008 to 13.2 million in 2023, 2024. And, attracts, the spending of 19.62 billion in 2007, 2008, up to 80.4 billion in 2023, 2024. Old age grants beneficiaries, for instance, increased from almost 2.23 million in 2027, 2028 to 4 million in 2023, 2024. drawing a spending profile of 22.8 billion in 2027 to 2023 to over 98.5 billion in 2023-2024. Social relief of distress grant, which was introduced under the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, in 2022, 2023, 2024, involved a spending of 33.47 billion rand. Total investment in social grants increased from 62.47 billion in 2017 to 250.54 billion in 2023-2024. Total tax deduction, because that needs to be balanced in terms of this, total tax deduction, for instance, allowed in 2023 tax year was 289 billion. And this is a form of fiscal welfare following the classification used by Richard Titmuss. Public welfare in South Africa remains funded largely, overwhelmingly, essentially funded through the fiscus. Then there are two other, components of social policy in the South African context. There's the social insurance, which involves contributions from members or beneficiaries. And this will range from occupational pension, which could be defined benefits or defined contributions, depending on the structuring of the, pension scheme, to medical aid or medical insurance, to the unemployment insurance fund, contribution, which provides some supplementary income for people when they become unemployed, after contributing to this. And then the final dimension of it will be public works program, extended public works program, which was established precisely to provide poverty and income relief through temporary work for the unemployed to carry out socially useful activities. We can relate to other mechanisms, other instruments, for instance, the indigency program, for instance, at municipality level, access to basic water and basic electricity, and so on and so forth. Thank you. Ngiyabonga.
Thanks, Prof. Adeshina. I think maybe we should take Ms. Isobel Fire, with your permission, Prof, and then we have a discussion after she also presents. I think that may be a better idea, that both presentations are given, and then we can have a discussion on both presentations. That will be the approach I suggest.
Yeah,
so to welcome Ms. Isobel Fire, who's known to Fire to many of us since the days of Naledi, when some of us first interacted with her, and of course she later established the Institute for Studies in Poverty and Inequality, starting with an ASSAf called SCfRPI. And now she's currently with Oxfam and also involved with DPME in relation to G20, which is very known, I think, to most of us as an activist, one of the leading thinkers on these issues of social protection, and the influence that she's also having in our government and the discussions in South Africa debate around these important issues. Over to you, Ms. Frey. Go ahead. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Prof, and thank you. It's a great privilege to be here and to be speaking amongst academics. I do need to say first and foremost that I am not an academic, but a social activist. And I sit on the ASSAf subcommittee, I think, as a strange fellow, but it's always useful, I think, for us to share disciplines and to gather greater insights. So thank you to Professor Adesina as well for that overview of social policy. When I first met him, it was really exciting to have a kindred spirit, and of course, the late Professor Thandikwe Mantantandariwa was someone who also inspired a lot of my early writing. Vusi, I remember the first meeting back in the presidency, and it's been a privilege to have you alongside since then. So I'm going to speak on social protection and social security as social justice, and picking up one aspect of the social policy canvas that Professor Jimmy was looking at. I am very bad at working out how to, there we go, transitioning my slides, so do bear with me. So just to start with the question of what is social justice, because I think it's important that we have definitions up front in order to be able to ensure that we are talking the same things. Two references to social justice that I like is that social justice is aimed at promoting a society which is just and equitable, valuing diversity, providing equal opportunities to all its members, irrespective of their disability, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, or religion, and ensuring fair allocation of resources and support for their human rights. In simple terms, social justice refers to one's responsibility to care for others for the common good of society. So locating the individual within a broader parameter of interests. And then it's important to define social protection and social security. Drawing from the ILO recommendation 202 on social protection flaws, social protection is a set of policies and programs designed to reduce and prevent poverty and vulnerability across the life cycle. So some people refer to that from the cradle to the grave, whether you're a child sort of pre-earning, whether you are earning or not earning, but of working age, or exited the labor market on the other side. Social security is a subset of social protection, providing income support, and some also include access to healthcare. So there are a variety of categories of assistance, child benefits, unemployment support, maternity protection, old age pension, and child coverage. And the aims are to ensure a basic level of income security and access to essential health for all. The idea of the welfare of people. Professor Adesina referred to Richard Titmuss, who many refer to as the father of social policy, and it's about ensuring that nobody in a good society falls below a certain minimum of access to support. I've got to apologize, I had flu last week and it seems to be appearing again. So if we're looking at social justice and we're looking at social security, we need to look at the instruments that guarantee access to social justice. And those are a variety of them, both international as well as more regional, and of course, our own constitution that Professor Adesina referred to. So the first, in terms of accessing or guaranteeing social security, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, followed by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights at a United Nations level, the South African Constitution, Section 27(1)(c), the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the SADC Charter of Fundamental Social Rights, has a protection of social protection as a key labor right. And finally, the AU Social Policy Framework and Protocol on Social Protection of 2022. The points that Professor Adesina referred to in terms of progressive realization is one that's critical to the rights basis for the expansion of social security. We talk about an internal limitation. So it's section 27(1)(c). Sorry, normally I have my constitution to hand. Guarantees to everybody the right to social security, to those unable to provide for themselves social assistance, subject to, and it's to be progressively realized subject to the state's available resources. Now that wording comes from the UN International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, Article 9, which guarantees the right to social security. There's a slight differentiation in the fourth bullet point, which uses maximum available resources. In South African Constitution, it refers to available resources, but the legal thinking is very similar. So there's a general comment number 19, which explains the state's obligations. And the key principle there is that states must take deliberate, concrete, and targeted steps towards full realization. So though a state may start with a minimum coverage, it does need to constantly improve both the headcount and the value in terms of progressive realization towards universal enjoyment. The understanding being that once states get to higher levels of well-being and economic growth, the standard constantly increases. The use of maximum available resources means that budgeting and prioritizing social security must occur even under economic constraints. The principle of non-retrogression means that once benefits are in place, they should not be arbitrarily reduced. So we can't say we think that there's been enough spend on social security for the last 5 years. We think that healthcare needs to benefit more. There has to be a rational explanation. And in terms of the ICSCR, there is a principle of minimum core obligations to ensure at least essential levels of benefits for all, especially vulnerable groups. I'm a lawyer. From a jurisprudential perspective in South Africa, the Constitutional Court differed from the minimum core and relied on reasonableness. But in the most recent judgment handed down, which is under appeal in the Gauteng High Court, brought by the IEJ against Minister of Social Development, there is a suggestion that perhaps the South African judiciary is moving towards minimum core to aid them. But let's look at the impact of social security on inequality and growth. So what we can see, Professor Gumede, please give me a 5-minute warning because I love this topic, so I will talk. So we can see that there is a legal obligation on the state as the duty bearer to provide social security. And that in itself should be a binding obligation. But there are also other reasons why social security should be important in addition to social justice. And that's looking at the impact of social security on inequality and growth. I quote a number of sources there, but the idea is that social transfers, social cash transfers, the cash grants, reduce income inequality by about 30% on average in developed countries. And in low and middle income countries, social safety nets can reduce poverty by about 36% on average. So that's pretty high ranking. We know in South Africa that our 3 main challenges are poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So there we immediately get a suggestion of the benefits of cash transfers or social assistance grants. In South Africa, there is equally evidence that shows that grants can reduce the inequality measure, the Gini coefficient, from 0.69 to 0.44 after transfers, which is a significant reduction. Investment in social protection is also associated with long-term economic growth and resilience, and there is a high return on human capital development from early childhood grants. And here, just to quote, and this is from a UNDP publication, which I can share. Sorry, let me just go back to it. It is often believed that the best means of tackling inequality is by targeting social security transfers at the poorest members of society. Indeed, while this sounds intuitive, it is in fact an incorrect belief. In reality, as demonstrated by the evidence, higher reductions in inequality are achieved by countries that invest in universal social security. Within OECD countries, for example, high impacts of inequality have been achieved by those countries with a greater commitment to universal transfers. The best examples are countries in Scandinavia. Sweden's Ministry of Finance explains how the Nordic model of social security is predicated on universal transfers. So there's a reference there to the paradox of redistribution. And using data from the Luxembourg income study, they devised an index of the degree of targeting transfers and found that this was negatively related to income redistribution, measured as the reduction in the Gini coefficient from market income to disposable income. In other words, countries with more universal social security systems achieved greater redistribution. I am going to move on. There we go. So looking at social security coverage in South Africa versus other upper middle income countries, in South Africa, about 55% of the population is covered by at least one social protection grant. The child support grant covers 13 million children. The unemployment insurance fund, which is social insurance, has a very limited coverage of 5% of the labor force. Other upper middle income countries, the average is between 65 to 75% coverage, which includes countries including Brazil, China, and Mexico. Ours, of course, compares as 55%. And we know that the gaps in South Africa are largely the informal sector and the working poor who are excluded from the targeted social security and social insurance coverage, as well as the social insurance. So just looking here at social assistance coverage in South Africa. So the aim of these grants, of these slides, are to demonstrate that although the coverage is high in some senses, the need is also greater. And so the challenge that I will conclude on in terms of social justice is that we need to work in expanding access to social assistance in order to meet the kinds of redistributive levels required by our constitution. So looking at social assistance in South Africa using 2024-25 data, some of this Professor Adesina said, 27.7 million people received social assistance. That's the total, the blue. The child support grant is the largest part of that, the old age grant. We had 4.3 million people receiving these. So all the social grants in South Africa are means tested for poverty. And now just looking at the expanded unemployment rate. And the reason that I put this in is for us to see, in terms of income, the usual source of income for adults is through wage income. But if you don't have access to a job, the question is, where does that income come from? And that's really where the residual right to social assistance would come into play. So looking at the expanded definition of unemployment, looking at Q1 of 2025, sorry, it's not 2024-25 data, it's Q1. And we include the discouraged work seekers because those are people who are not employed. They've given up looking for work, but that's because they're discouraged, not because they're unemployed. So 43.1%. The labor market, the labor force participation is 60%. And there was a decline there of almost 300,000 from the previous quarter. So that's an incredibly high level of unemployed working age adults. Again, Professor Adesina had this data as well. We're looking at a very serious situation, and this is General Household Survey data, where 50.4% of households received at least one grant, and just under a quarter, 23.8%, identified grants as their main income source. So there is an increasing reliance on grants for survival, which in itself is a social policy red flag. And here I come to my evidence, really, which is showing that our grant system might be, it does have a lot of headcount coverage, but is the value sufficient? So looking at child malnutrition and the child support grant coverage in South Africa. So the stunting rate of children under 5 in South Africa using 2022 UNICEF Stats SA data is around 27%. And yet the child support grant reaches 70% of eligible children. So the grant of 530 Rand per month is below the food poverty line. So we know that the child support grant is augmented by other social policy tools such as school nutrition, and that reduces hunger. But we have this challenge that although we have an incredibly high level of child receipt of the child support grant, we still have an incredibly high level of stunting. So if we look at the adequacy of South Africa's minimum social assistance, and here I'm just invoking a method used by the OECD. Basically, there's a calculation. It considers income support adequate if it's about 50% of median disposable income. So doing a calculation there, it's evident that the child support grant is equivalent to about 17.7% of median threshold. So it's well below the OECD adequacy benchmark. And that's something that I think we need to look at, that the 50% threshold would be about 36,000 Rand per year. And the child support grant, in effect, is 6,360 Rand per year. Not per month, but per year. So it's 17.7% of the threshold. So just looking there, sort of comparing, we know that the grant receipt is 50% of households. The primary source of income is about 25, just 24%. We know that the child support grant is the greatest, is the greatest grant that goes to households, and we know that its value is incredibly small compared to an OECD adequate minimum. So, in conclusion, and people on this call, Jimmy and Vusi will know that I am a firm supporter of social security. I also am a firm supporter of universal basic income. In terms of the lens of social justice, I think we need to look at the social assistance system, looking at the obligations on the duty bearers, which is the state generally, in terms of human rights instruments. That needs to be the point of departure. Using the lens or tools of analysis of access, adequacy, and quality, that really needs to guide budget allocations and system design. And in conclusion, universal coverage of all into a decent basic income system would promote social as well as economic justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Ms. Fry, and much appreciated that social justice perspective, which I think is very important for all of our societies and us here in South Africa, given all the challenges that we still face as society, which actually we shouldn't, arguably. We should be doing much better than we are doing. So there we are, colleagues, in our first series, first in the series of webinars dealing with social protection and social justice, primarily with a concern on employment creation. Prof. Tima Deshina presented a relatively comprehensive picture of social policy in South Africa, but also assisting us in the conceptualization, which is usually a debate about what you're really talking about. What are you talking about when you talk about social policy? So I think that was very helpful, Prof. Additional, just that comprehensive perspective, so that we are all of the same mind as we deliberate on this very important these important issues. So we have an opportunity now for Q&A. So I think if we're able to see, I can see there's something specific already for Miss Isobel, a question for Miss Isobel, and if you're able to read that for us, I mean, look at it for us, please, Miss Frywise. I look at the other ones, because I think in the chat, some people were also posting in the chat, not only in the Q&A. Please try and post in the Q&A. That's where we're trying to focus, but it's okay if you also post in the chat. We'll attend to that. So let me start. There is a comment or a question. Maybe do you want to start there? Maybe Ms. Fry, before I read this,
Yes.
if you can please, I'll appreciate it.
So thank you to Shinta for that question. Is if countries with more universal models of social security achieve greater redistribution, how would such a model work in South Africa where inequality and the need at the lower level is very high? So I think this is an excellent question. It goes to the heart of universality. And many argue that if you have limited resources, you should target the poorest of the poor, the most poor. The counterintuitive argument to that is that for a number of reasons, targeting does not affect greater equality. And in fact, it doesn't enable countries to move out of poverty. There was a 2008 World Bank study, which starts off with South Africa as an example. It's a global study, and it indicates that where you have extremely high levels of income inequality to begin with, you'll never be able to get people out of extreme poverty because the floor just doesn't lift. And the point about why universal is better is in short, because where everybody receives benefit from a program, whether you're middle class, whether you are extremely poor, whether you are elite, you have an interest in ensuring that that program is protected when budgets are allocated and when Parliament votes on the budget. So there are decades of evidence from programs across the world to show that demonstrates that if it is a universal program, it will not only be protected against erosion, but it will also actually grow that progressive realization we speak of. I do want to just indicate that for most countries where you have universal programs, the benefit is taxed back from people above the income tax threshold. So it's not a case of just giving more money to the poor, I mean, to the rich. Oh, sorry. I will do so. So it's distributed equally, but it's almost like negative targeting is taxed back from the wealthy, but it's protected. And then, sorry, Shinta also asked about is it useful to use the OECD economies as a standard? I think definitely we acknowledge that there is a difference in income in South Africa compared to OECD countries, but I think it's an incredibly helpful standard, and we can debate whether we use the median or the mean income as a standard. But I am always loath when people argue that we shouldn't use measures. We can look at the significant difference and say we have further to go, but we need to have a baseline in order to go somewhere. Thank you, Prof. I don't know if you want me to look at Comedi's question as well.
Okay, let's see, where are we here? So there's another one. Let me read that one in the meantime. Also, perhaps for Prof. Additional to reflect on that. So Kemedi Kapola says here, Section 27 of the Constitution states that individuals have the right to social security. However, many young people, those are 18 plus, have fallen outside the social protection scheme prior to the SDR grant of 350. And this will be the case should it end, should the SDR special relief of distress end. And what does that mean from a social policy perspective? So I think it's a broad question that I suppose we all need to reflect on. And maybe Prof. Addition, if you've seen it, if you're able to make some reflections on that issue that's been posed.
No, I thank you very much, Professor Committee. You know, the critical, question, about access here is premised on the additional premise that affects some of the, even functionaries within the state, which is the notion that somehow, able-bodied people within a prime working age, for instance, should be encouraged to seek employment rather than depend on state handouts. But in the context in which, people who are willing to work are not able to find employment, you simply cannot just dump them into the, what do you call it, they swim or sink, and the aspect of that is that some acknowledgement of collective responsibility to people who are income deprived because of unemployment needs to be available for people. I mean, the question really is that Section 27 itself becomes problematic in the sense that it makes access to social assistance conditional on demonstrable inability to provide. But even in that situation, for instance, you would think that, people who are not able to provide for themselves will be supported, but there is the countervailing and normative framing of social assistance, which suggests that, if you are able-bodied, the point is to find employment for you. But we're in a context in which it's not that people may not be willing to work, it's simply that employment is not available.
Thanks, Prof. Additional. You can continue, or were you done? You were done, Prof. Additional.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Please go ahead there, Ms. Fry.
Thanks. I think Professor Adesina spelled out the conundrum really well. I think the historic challenge also needs to be spelled out. So our constitution was adopted in 1996, and that's one where the human rights basis is introduced. But our Social Assistance Act is actually largely taken from a 1992 act, a pre-democracy act, which incorporates a kind of categorization of need, which was based on an assumption of what was required for white people under apartheid. And so you have poor children, you have poor old age pensioners, but the whole working age from 18 to 59, as that the question was looking at youth, which would be 18 to 35. The assumption was that white men, white breadwinners, would be guaranteed work through job reservation, etc. So there was no need to provide social assistance as a category for 18 to 59-year-olds, the working age adults. And that's the conundrum that we have now, is that we have deracialized the country, but the categories of need. And that's why the social relief of distress grant, which came in around COVID, was significant in many ways, because it was the first time that cash grants, social grants, were allocated to working age people. I do want to just say, with regards to what Professor Adesina said about the challenge of the smaller category of social assistance, Section 27 1C needs to be taken in its totality, of the right to social security for all, and then social assistance for the poor. So if in a system where we are able to include everybody into social insurance, where workers are able to contribute, and we're able to address the kinds of schemes that informal workers are able to contribute to, etc., we can swell the kind of the pool of people who are able to provide through social insurance for their well-being. And so the category of social assistance as poor relief would be shrunk. But that is the policy conundrum that we're dealing with. How do we, and this is global, it's not just South Africa, with the rise of informal employment, how do we have a new approach to social security, which as a scheme design came from sort of global north, Western democracies where full employment was the norm. Now we're having the inverse, actually, often. How do we make sure that people can contribute to their own well-being in a way that doesn't penalize them for being unemployed? Thanks.
Thanks. But you need the money. So that's the challenge. I guess that's a conundrum too, right? Isn't it? Ms. Fry, that proposition, you need the money. So you need to be able to finance. I think that's a point that other people will raise. So the financing of social policy itself becomes one of those issues that we need to tackle. I think as a committee, I think we discussed that as an area that we'd like to get into. Do you want to say anything, Prof, additional before we go to the next question? There's another question, it's a follow-up.
Well, I mean, that's why in the conception of transformative social policy, for instance, the idea is that your social policy cannot stand in splendid isolation from your economic policy. The objective of social policy investment is to drive up economic development, and economic development provides the basis for the financing of what do you call it, your social policy, something, for instance. But it turns on the ideational premise of the key actors from which they're proceeding. For instance, one of the disturbing aspects of means testing is that the poor have to demonstrate their poverty. They have to, it's a performative dimension, for instance, but they have to demonstrate their poverty. And there are people who, on a matter of what do you call it, ideational principle, felt that it was too intrusive, it would be too intrusive, and therefore the option for universality is based on the premise of the need to protect people's dignity, and so on and so forth. So that itself, because regardless of the level of economic development, if you don't have a shift in the ideational premise of your social policy, you just take a look at the case of the United States, for instance, as an example, and you get a sense of what I'm talking about. Where a political party, for instance, demonizes people who are on public, welfare schemes. So the whole idea of paying attention to your economy, economic growth and economic development becomes essential for a synergistic relationship and coupling of social policy and social, so yeah, we have to pay attention to how we finance social policy, but we also have to pay attention in that context to the nature of economic, policy making and economic development. So that'll be my response.
So I was actually very pleased when Ms. Fry was citing a World Bank study that was against targeting, because many of us were of the view that it actually came from them. The conversation of social assistance, social protection, which many years back, Tangam Kanda had written against that. Targeting is just a no. We shouldn't be doing that. It has to be universal. Anyway, I might have digressed, so let me allow Ms. Fry, want to come back in, and you have a question as well, a follow-up question that you may need to address.
Thanks very much. I'm really enjoying this conversation. So, and I mean, that's very true about the World Bank. And I've had conversations with the Minister of Finance about the destructive nature of targeting. I was doing some work up in Graskop in Mpumalanga when the 350 grant came out. And if you recall, the means test there is pretty low. At one stage, it was 350. Now, the point about cash transfers is that they're a regular guaranteed amount. People are able to both make plans, but also it's a guarantee to others. And I was interviewing an informal builder who he started getting the 350 because he had no other forms of income. He took his SASSA guarantee to the hardware store and said, I'll be getting this grant. And they gave him cement and bricks in anticipation of the fact that he would be getting the grant. And he received it for 2 months, so that was 700 Rand. Had started a number of building material projects within the township. And SASSA saw that he was getting money coming in, and they stopped his grant. And so, in effect, each of the building projects continued to be where it was. He wasn't able to complete them because the low-income clients of his could not pay him huge amounts, so they were paying it off. And there was an internal economy that was built on a maximizer of the income that the state was guaranteeing. And I want to respond on that basis to Himna's question about where does money come from? And I think it's important to remember from a policy perspective that there are two sources of the financing. I mean, the first is there is an internal multiplier that comes from social security state spending. And this is something that the ILO is looking at. We were working at my former institute, SPI, with a Brazilian group of economists at Sao Paulo University. And there's an isolated multiplier that just because of the spend, there is economic growth. So people who receive the grant, and there's a greater propensity to spend amongst low-income earners. So if you're middle class and rich, you might save 50% of the income that you have, put it to your pension, etc. But the poor spend 100% of what they get. And so that there's a multiplier there. And then there's a future multiplier. We know that kids who have better nutrition are less likely to develop lifestyle diseases such as diabetes and that growing older. So not only are they more productive when they have jobs, as Professor Adesina was pointing out, but they're also less likely to pull down on the fiscus from state health care that they would need otherwise. So there is a positive return on the money in longer term, but the immediate is the question is harnessing that social security multiplier, and we're working with Treasury to look at that. There is also a question of greater taxation, and as Oxfam, we're part of a global movement that's saying we need to tax high net worth individuals, tax the 1%. The recent years, we've seen arguments to reduce taxation and to say that both corporates and individuals should not be burdened with tax. And so we've seen a massive shift of available income that used to be public. So the public spend used to be larger than the private spend because of the reduction of taxes and tax havens and illicit financial flows on the global basis. The state has very little money that it can. And we saw that 10 years ago, the last financing for development at ASSAf, which was dubbed the Wall Street Consensus, where governments were told, borrow from the private sector in order to fund your development. And I mean, Professor Gumedi will say to you that you can't give interest on private sector investment and still not provide a further level of taxation on users. So user fees came in from the World Bank. So there are returns on investment, but there is also an ideological need to say the state needs to have sufficient resources to be able to allocate. And so that's where the redistributive aspect of tax and transfer comes in. I mean, that's a classic sort of northern industrial state, which is redistribution happens both through taxation of those whose incomes are slightly higher, but also that redistribution, the transfers have to be redistributive. So again, you might have a universal transfer, but the redistribution happens in the taxation of it. So there are definite ways of looking, but I think that, I mean, I know that in the last 20, even 30 years, treasuries have been encouraged to look differently at the value of allocations and spending. Thank you.
Yes. And I think it takes us to the point, I mean, that's been made by many, and Prof. Adesina and others have made around, how do we link? I mean, it has to be, so we still need to think quite hard about, practically how social and economic policy interface for the advancement of well-being in our societies, and here in South Africa in particular. So some of us have been trying to do this, and Prof. Adesina has gracefully agreed to do an endorsement for our book that is attempting to address some of these issues, and maybe some of the issues that we'll tackle in the future webinars. Are there any other questions or anything you want to say, Prof. Adesina, as we look at additional inputs, if there are any?
Well, I mean, actually, to get back to the point about what do you call it, taxation. I mean, it's almost like a death, knell, on political projects these days. If you talk about, increased taxation, but we know that what is called the golden age, in the OECD context, for instance, which would be in the 50s and the 60s, for instance, personal income tax level, and corporate tax level are considerably much higher than they are today, and this became the basis for driving up reducing inequality and financing social welfare schemes. I mean, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, that in fact what is happening today is in itself a misnomer, in terms of the way in which and the reason why it is possible to offer, and I say this with all, to offer somebody 350 rand, and celebrate it, is because the middle class and the wealthy have not had to put themselves in the shoes of the people who are concerned. When you have a situation where you're offering people money at daily rate of less than a loaf of bread, it's nothing to celebrate, and to just be on the whose side of the argument, if you're a billionaire, for instance, how much of that money do you actually get to spend, for needs, in a situation where in the same society, people don't have access to food, don't have access to housing, and so on and so forth. And it's the extent to which we think of society as belonging to all, and therefore that the well-being of everyone is the responsibility of everybody. That becomes the basis for a rethinking, of social policy. We know that targeting by itself, means tested schemes doesn't do much to address inequality. You just look at the debates around the NHI, for instance, at the moment, and you get a sense that there are people who are comfortable with having access to the best healthcare system that the country can offer, and completely oblivious to the tragedy of a system that caters for 84% of the population at a fraction of the resources available to the private facilities, and yet comfortable with saying, well, it's not my problem, as it were. And you look at situations such as need for, renal machine, for instance, and where in public health facilities, for instance, this is, to be shared, sometimes, run down and so on and so forth, so but these ideational contestations are not uncommon. It's for those who are, making the argument for a more expansive, coverage, access, for instance, to stay at the battle line, and continue to push for their, agenda. I mean, I think a helpful dimension to the rights language of rights in the Constitution is that it empowers, equips the civil society activists and the judiciary to seek to push the frontiers of these things. I mean, we look at access to antiretroviral, medication, for instance, the Treatment Action Campaign and contestations around that, for instance. Currently, IEJ, Institute of Economic Justice, and Isabel's old outfit, Social Policy Initiative, for instance, have been pushing the agenda, and I think it's the staying the line, and pushing that becomes quite important, in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. We should all keep pushing and staying in the line indeed. There are two additional questions that I think we should address. Time is getting tighter and tighter. We're left with 8 minutes. So if you could please just look through as panelists, we've got one from our own boss here, Dr. Hilma Sudulal, who's asking, I think we've addressed that issue though, but let me read it. She says, with the high rate of unemployment and low number of people who contribute to the fiscus, where is the money going to come from for the right to access of social security and given all other allocations that taxes contribute to? I think we've kind of tackled it when we're talking about the financing of social policy. And I think it's an issue that we'll have to come back to. So I think we're unanimous in the standing committee that we need to have a session that looks at the financing of social policy, including, healthcare, health insurance, and such issues. So, but anybody can get into it. But let me read the other one as well in the interest of time, so we can take both of them and see if we can conclude in 7 minutes as scheduled. The second one says, on a theoretical level, do you believe that concepts of social justice are adequately reflected in transitional justice theories? This is in the chart. Or approaches which influence the development of these policies. So a link between, I suppose, concepts of justice and what transitional justice pushes for. So those are the two that I think you'll please share amongst yourself. And
very quickly.
Also do the closing input so that we are able to close on time.
Yeah. So I hope that I have started to address Himla's question previously, and I think that it is important to identify or to take it very seriously. I do have a different perspective. My perspective is that the economies of countries are meant to be run for the benefit of people. So to actually say, can people afford to ask for bread? Can people afford to ask for medicine when we have a constitution that guarantees access to everybody? And we know that we are the most unequal country in the world. So it's not that we're a highly indebted poor country. We're an upper middle income country. We have the resources. We have a constitution which binds all organs of state and every person in the state. We have a right to equality. And yet time and again, we're told by those who, the fund managers, I mean, our wealth is really being managed on behalf of funds, the members of which are scattered across the world. We don't have national resources in the way that was seen as previously being done. And as Professor Adesina said, between apartheid and now, we've halved the corporate income tax, the tax rate on companies, because we believe that they're going to flee. At the same time, we made the decision to allow companies to register offshore. So there is a very deliberate stacking of our economic policies against the interests of the majority, who happen to be poor. So I think we need to say, as a colleague of mine, Duma Kabule, writes, he says that the unemployment requires a war effort in order to address it. We've got 12.3 million adults unemployed on a daily basis. This is not going to be a trickle-down effect. We need to be looking, where do the resources come from? We've got a fully paid up government employee pension fund. Now, I'm not saying to all of you who are government employees that we take it all, but very few funds globally are fully paid up. We don't need to be able to pay every single civil servant no one's going to resign en masse tomorrow. So there are ways of loosening up the ways that the wealth of this country is allocated, but definitely not to be scared of saying the resources in this country, the extractives, that need, if companies are not going to be employing, then they need to be paying tax. And I think there's something to looking at that. The question about transitional justice I find fascinating, because I don't think we had it. We might have had the TRC, but we certainly didn't have transitional justice because we didn't have restorative justice. Now, whether that's Section 25 of the Constitution looking, and it doesn't just refer to land, it refers to all property. And property is also accumulated wealth. So the accumulated wealth pre-1994, which was almost entirely 99.99% in the hands of whites, that continues. And so we had the shift from the RDP, which was looking at growth through redistribution, freeing up the available resources to be shared equally and therefore grow, to redistribution through growth. So the only redistribution which was going to happen after GEAR was in economic growth. But you got the conundrum because you can't grow because too few people have access to it. And so we have this, I think it's now about a 13-year low growth cycle, because we're not disturbing the fact. So it's both restorative, transitional justice, but it also makes economic sense. Thank you.
Thanks. Prof. Adesina, in your parting shots, as you react, if you react to any of those two issues, I think already on the financing, we're unanimous. I think when we debated in the standing committee that we'll have a session on that. So I think we'll have to tackle it there. But go ahead, please, Prof. Adesina.
No, I mean, I think, the argument about permanent scarcity, which raises the question of, how do you finance it? Remember this, let's take the example of the NSFAS, for instance. Initially it was the panel that was set up was recommending the US type of student loan system. Okay. And it took a maverick turn, for former presidents to declare that, they will be available. The resources came through nonetheless. But this is where the conundrum comes in. The limitation on states, public resources, for instance, revenue available itself, is a function of the trajectory of economic policy. So you can't free one without addressing the primary thing. The assumption is that, economic issues, it should be left to the treasury and to be left to the private sector. The point ultimately is that it's everybody's problem. And unless we address the trajectory, of the economic policy, for instance, we'll be chasing the wrong issues and making victims of people who, through no fault of theirs, are unable to work, even when it's rather than just unwilling, to work. And the nature of the idea that drives society, the idea that frames the way we think about well-being, becomes quite important in this regard. This is not something that we think of as a problem for those who are in the midst of who are victims of the situation. But unless we address the trajectory of economic policy itself, we'll just be chasing their shadows. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we'll close it off there. Just hope there's no other question. Oh, there we are. My question is, South Africa at the moment, is it at the moment the best shape? Is that the best shape to achieve social protection with the unemployment continuing to rise? Well, I think we've addressed this question to a very large extent. Thanks for posing it to anonymous attendee, but I think we've tried to. And as we're saying, we're setting the stage. This is the first in a series of webinars that is a standing committee of ASSAf. We've agreed will convene. So I think we're getting ideas as well about what to look at in the next webinars. I'm going to try and close so that we can save time. Do you want to say something, Prof. Teshina, before I close?
No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Fine. You're covered. Okay. So what's left really for me is to thank our presenters who volunteered, or we imposed on them that they must participate in this inaugural webinar. These are members of the standing committee on the science on the reduction of poverty and inequality. So we really appreciate Prof. Teshina and Ms. Fry that you participate in the inaugural of the series of the webinars that we're going to be convening, and to thank very much Ms. Ruzani and Dr. Kuso and Dr. Melusi, the ASSAf team actually that ensured that this takes place. And of course, all the members of the standing committee that I have a privilege to be a chair of, which is probably explaining why I'm moderating this first webinar. And of course, to acknowledge our leaders. I saw Prof. Himmler was here and posed a question from ASSAf, the CEO there. Thanks for attending and engaging, as always. And all our members in the committee, ASSAf, I saw quite a number of them when I was checking was participating. It's greatly appreciated, everyone, for making the time and attending this. We'll be seeing you in the next webinar. Thank you very much. We've come to the end.